Yes, welcome to the plenary talk of season 2 in the Keio International Christian University Linguistic Colloquium. I'm Seunghun Lee from International Christian University. I teach phonetics and phonology here. And today we have Professor Donca Steriade from MIT giving her talk. Professor Steriade told me that if you have any questions, especially clarification questions during the talk, you should ask them without waiting until the end of the talk. So please send them to me, and we will make sure that the clarification questions are addressed. 発表途中に質問ある方は必ず僕に私に質問を送ってくれたらその対応してるのでなんかお願いします。さあ、we will start the talk with the introduction by Professor Shigeto Kawahara from Keio University.
All right. Thank you, Seunghun. So I prepared this slide. Just allow me to spend like 5 minutes to talk about Donca. First of all, about this event, this is a plenary lecture for the Keio ICU-LINC series, season 2. And these series are organized by me at Keio University and Seunghun Lee at ICU. And this particular plenary talk is co-hosted by the Phonetic Society of Japan, thanks to Professor Kubozono. And we would like to hereby acknowledge the financial support that we are getting from these organizations, Keio, ICU, and Phonetic Society of Japan. The general spirit behind organizing this event is that we all know that we are all negatively affected by the COVID, but we also want to look at the bright side too, which is that we can reinforce intellectual communication via online events like this one. All right, so this is why we are doing it. Why did I or we decide to invite Donca? If I may, Donca is my academic mother. When I started studying phonetics and phonology seriously, that was around 1919. Everybody was reading and citing Steriade in 1997, the article that was known as Licensing by Q. I think the article that is still known as Licensing by Q article. And together with Bruce Hayes, Donca led the phonetically driven phonology enterprise at UCLA, and that yielded a lot of influential dissertations and produced all these famous scholars. Okay. There are two fundamental insights behind the phonetically driven phonology, in my opinion. One is that phonological patterns are driven by phonetic imperatives, like promoting articulatory ease and enhancing perceptual distinctiveness. But what's more important, nevertheless, phonetics and phonology are kind of separate systems. They're interrelated, but separate, in the sense that formalisms developed by phonologists, optimality theory in that era, are useful in modeling these phonological patterns. Okay. What Donca meant to me, too romantic maybe. When I was a graduate student, the UMass Linguistics department was pretty critical of this phonetically driven phonology enterprise, but I really liked it. I loved thinking about phonology in terms of why it happens and what's the phonetic imperative behind it. So Donca was pretty much the direct source of my inspiration, and although she was not officially my PhD committee, she was, in my mind, non-official mentor. So if I'm allowed to talk about my dissertation, I talked about the phonetic underpinning of geminate devoicing in Japanese. That was in chapter 3, and that was directly inspired by Donca's PMAP theory. And my work on Japanese rap lyrics, dissertation chapter 5 and 6, is inspired by her work on Romanian half rhymes. So I searched through my old computer and was a pleasant surprise that I still have that handout. So 18 years ago, December 2002, Donca gave this colloquium talk at UMass when I was their first year student, I think. And she talked about half rhymes in Romanian rhymes, poetry. And she talked about, half rhyme patterns in Romanian. And after the colloquium talk, I talked to Donca and said, hey, I like Japanese rap lyrics, and they have lots of examples of half rhymes. And then she asked me to tell me some examples, and then she also asked me to rap in that event. And we were chatting before this talk, and Donca still remembers. So this how we met. This is how I met Donca. Good memory. And this resulted in a paper that's still that I'm proud of, I guess. And this had a significant influence on my outreach activity these days, because right now I work with professional Japanese rappers to use rappers to educate people, to elementary school kids, teach how Japanese works through Japanese rhymes and stuff. And this is one of my main activities right now. So I'm very grateful for Donca for opening up this opportunity. All right, now on to Donca's research. Donca's research covers a wide range of topics: metrical phonology, geminants, phonetic-phonetic interface, neutralization, historical phonology, the phonology of ancient languages, morphological cyclicity, you name it. But when I think about Donca's research, there are two adjectives that come to my mind. And any guesses? Mine is bold and fundamental. So Donca rarely does a case study of the then dominant framework. What she does instead is she challenges fundamental assumptions about what we are doing. Here are some examples. In 1990s, people were using underspecification theory to capture markedness asymmetry. And her paper in the Handbook of Phonological Theory in 1995 kind of killed it. We've been assuming that phonetics and phonology are two separate components of grammar. And in a series of papers, Donca said, wait a minute, we cannot study one without the other. It was a common assumption that syllable structure determines which contrast can appear where, and the licensing by Q article kind of killed it too. Another example, a final one, stress placement was computed based on syllable structure, but Donca proposed this V2V interval notion, which may be able to capture the stress pattern better. The question that pops up every so often in Donca's research is that, really, to what extent do we need UG to explain phonological patterns? And by UG, I mean, or she means, I think, a domain-specific learning device. Specific questions being, how much of phonological knowledge can be modeled by taking into consideration phonetic imperatives, and what's left? How much can we really learn from experience? We obviously learn a lot. We cannot really take the stimulus of poverty of stimulus argument at a face value when it comes to phonology, and what's left. So neither easy acceptance nor hard denial of UG. Instead, think hard what UG really is. That's what I'm getting, the message that I'm getting from Donca's research. Another notable aspect, this is the final slide, she does not hesitate to update her thinking, even if that means denial of her previous proposals. So her own dissertation is about how syllables are formed in ancient Greek and other languages, and she's now saying that we don't need syllables in phonological theory. And another example is this: she has written influential papers on underspecification theory, but she kind of killed it in 1995 paper. So I'm very looking forward to see what theory she's going to kill today. Without further ado, I'll pass the button to Donca.
Thank you very much, Shigeto. I'm very grateful for your extremely generous introduction, and very long, I must say. I'm also very grateful to Seunghun and to Haruo Kubozono, who together with Keio and ICU and PSJ have invited me to speak to colleagues in Japan and colleagues in Korea and colleagues on the Pacific coast. I'm very happy to see at least the names of friends and colleagues in the audience. And I hope we can overcome the limitations imposed by the distance between us. So now I want to share my screen with you. I trust you have a handout. Okay. Okay, so I am being told by my computer that I am screen sharing and that you see my screen. Here is what I would suggest as far as interaction with the audience goes. I would like to, the most important thing for me is to not lose contact with the audience. That is not to proceed with the presentation. Thank you. Thank you. If there is anybody in the audience who finds something that's unclear, so there are two ways to prevent you from missing something. Write a question in the chat, and Shigeto, Seunghun, and Haruo promise to watch out for the chat. The other thing is to unmute yourselves. If there is something urgent, if you think that I have said something that I didn't mean to say, or that if there is something that didn't make any sense, then please unmute yourselves and just ask clarification questions, and hopefully at the very end, we'll have an extended discussion. Okay, so here is what I want to do today. I want to discuss the relationship between the phonological cycle or cyclic inheritance, the title of my talk, as conceived by Noam Chomsky and Maurice Halley in the 1950s and the 60s. So this is the pattern in Roman 1 under 1 on my handout, and the phenomena that are listed in Roman 2 through Roman 5 under 1, some of which may be less familiar to you. So I'm going to define all of them in a preliminary way, and then I'm going to explain what exactly the project is about. Okay, so cyclic inheritance or the standard cycle, these are similarities between the stems of derivatives and their immediate constituents, and I will say more about this in a second. Pseudocyclic inheritance is a similarity between derivatives and other related words, that is, words that they share a root with. Paradigm uniformity is the stem similarity between cells of inflectional paradigms. Morphomes are stem syncretism, cases of stem syncretism that are syntactically arbitrary whenever they are different from items 1 through 3. And paradigm contrast, these are cases in which you have to have distinctness between the cells of inflectional paradigms, either at a stem level or at a word level. So if some of these things are unfamiliar, don't worry, we will come back to each one of them. Now, there are certain common properties among all of these patterns that I've just listed in one. They are all relations between pairs of lexically related expressions, that is, they expressions that share roots. And second, they all involved unexpected systematic surface similarity in the sense that the forms that are connected by these patterns are unexpectedly similar in Roman 1 through Roman 4, and they are unexpectedly dissimilar in Roman 5. So I'm going to explain what the expectations are, in what sense I'm talking about unexpectedly similar or dissimilar. So here are some properties of cyclic inheritance that will clarify some of these terms. So I'm going to use here the example of the English verb fit, to fit, and the prefixed version of fit in the case of refit. So the stresses, in case you're not sure, it's fit on the unique syllable and refit on the final syllable. The one property of cyclic inheritance is that of predictability, in the sense that the information that's transmitted from the base to the derivative includes predictable grammar-assigned properties. So in the case of fit and refit, fit is the base, and refit is its derivative, and the stress of fit is predictable from some interaction of constraints. And we'll see in a second that the stress of refit is not predictable from that same interaction of constraints. The second property is asymmetry. This is known as base priority from Laura Benoit's dissertation. And that can be defined as observing that there is a markedness cost to the base and the derivative being similar to each other. And that cost is borne exclusively by the derivative. That's a sense in which there is an asymmetry between them. So for example, the stress of the derivative refit violates non-finality without having actually a markedness reason to violate non-finality, because notice that a disyllabic word like profit would lead one to expect refit. But in fact, refit, because it is based on fit, does not, has to violate non-finality. So this is an example of asymmetry. The third property is recursiveness. The derivative in one pair can function as a base in another pair. So refit as a derivative in the first pair can be the base in a further pair, refit as base, re-refit as derivative. And the last property is cyclic containment. This is going to be the interesting thing that we're focusing on today. The base, that is the form that transmits the information to the derivative, is an exponent of an immediate constituent of its derivative. So fit is an immediate constituent in refit. Refit is an immediate constituent in re-refit. Okay, so now I want to introduce two bits of terminology that will be helpful here. A base that is an immediate constituent of its derivative is a local base, abbreviated B subscript L. And any other kind of potential base is a remote base, B subscript R. So I'm going to be using this notation throughout. Okay. All right, so here is what I want to say in this talk. I want to observe that some of the properties that I've just listed, in particular, predictability, asymmetry, and recursiveness, can be found in other of the stem patterns that I've listed at the beginning of the talk in Roman 1 through 5. So in particular, predictability and asymmetry can be documented in all of the patterns in 1. Recursiveness is found in the patterns in 1 Roman 3 and 5, in addition to 1 Roman 1. But C containment is only invariably true in cyclic inheritance, that is 1 Roman 1. So here is what all of this means. All of the patterns in 1, I will claim, are cyclic-like. They share certain properties of cyclic inheritance. But most forms of cyclic-like inheritance are not governed by C containment. This is going to be the part that is, that's going to be the news now. They are very much like the cycle, but they aren't governed by C containment. And we can obtain a unified analysis of all of the patterns in 1 if we view C containment as a violable constraint rather than viewing C containment as an element of grammatical architecture. So when C containment is satisfied, when we view it as a violable constraint, then we derive standard cyclic patterns. When it is violated, and it can be violated to satisfy markedness or to satisfy optimal exponents or for other reasons, then we get the other patterns that I had listed in 1, in particular, paradigm uniformity, paradigm distinctness, morphemes, and the others. Okay, so now I want to speculate just a little bit about the remaining mechanisms that come together to define all of these patterns. I won't be talking in great detail about them, but I just want to give you a sense of what the thinking is behind some of the analysis. So there are certain general patterns that underlie all of the stem patterns in 1. Number 1, in 5a, they delimit the sets of forms that must be similar or dissimilar. So in the case of paradigm uniformity, you have to define what your paradigm is. That's a certain set of forms. So that's the delimitation of the relevant set of forms. Second, another general mechanism is that within a certain set of forms that either have to be similar or must be distinct from each other, you have to have a base or a hierarchy of preferred bases such that you give them priority in certain ways that I will be describing. So these are the general mechanisms that we're going to find them in every single one of the patterns in one. And now I can only speculate about how to think about these cases. I won't be talking about that in great detail, but here are my speculations. The sets that are relevant for the functioning of the patterns in one, these are sets for which similarity or dissimilarity is required, and they are defined by shared properties, including lexical relatedness, that is the fact that they share a root, shared syntactic properties, either one or more, and shared phonological properties. So we're going to talk about some of these things in what follows. As to how you choose a base, this is the question in 5b, within each set, some forms are more informative than others. This is an idea from Adam Albright's dissertation. Some of them are syntactically unmarked, whereas the others are marked. This is an idea from Andrew Garrett. And some of them are better known to the subjects than others, either in the sense that they are superior to others in type or token frequency. That will be an idea that will come up in this talk. Or the phonology is fixed by undominated markedness constraint, while that of other forms is not. That will also come up. So such items, the informative ones or the syntactically unmarked ones or the better known ones, they are selected as bases in their sets, and this is what we're going to be seeing. So this is just to give you a sense in which, the sense of how one can try to think in a unified way about all of the phenomena that I've listed in one. All right, so now what I'm going to do next is present to you in some detail the phenomenon of pseudocyclic inheritance that I listed in 1 Roman 2, and illustrate some of the things that I've said abstractly until now. This is coming from joint work with Juliet Stanton that will be cited in a bit. So the pseudocycle, to give you a definition, is a pattern of asymmetric stem similarity. The similarity involves predictable phonological properties between words that are built with derivational affixes and cognate words, words that are related to them. However, so it's very much like the definition of the cycle with one difference, which is that the base need not be a local base. So that's a sense in which C containment will not be satisfied. So I want to talk first about the case of English, which will be known to most of you. And then we'll talk about a case that comes from outside of English. So in English, Latinate derivatives, stress can be inherited from a remote base, that is from a word that is not an immediate constituent of the derivative. So that you can get a remote base in English in one of two ways. 9a, if the base is more deeply embedded inside the derivative than the local base would be. So as an example of this, let's take the derivative apostolicity, which whose stress is based on apostle. But the local base, the form to which you add the ity suffix is apostolic. Notice that the stress of apostolic is completely different from the stress of apostolicity. And in turn, the stress of apostolicity is essentially that of apostle. Okay, so that's a sense in which the little word inside apostolic is the one that gives stress to apostolicity. The other possibility is that a base, that the stress is based on a word that is not at all embedded in the derivative. So the base and the derivative are co-derivatives of the same root rather than either one of them being inside in some sense the other. So an example of this is the able adjective medicinable, something or somebody that can be cured based on medicinal. Okay. In turn, medicinal is a derivative of medicine, which can be a verb. It can be a noun, but it can also be a verb. When it is a verb, it has an able derivative, but notice that the able derivative, medicinable, has its stress based on medicinal, which is not at all embedded either within medicine or within the able derivative. Okay, so these are the two varieties of remote bases that we're going to be talking about. We're going to see that actually when you derive a Latinate derivative in English, you have a choice between a local and sometimes some remote bases. And that choice is based on obtaining a derivative that is faithful to the stress of its base, whether that is remote or local, but choosing a base that better satisfies markedness. So the analysis is going to be one in which faithfulness to the stress of the base is at the top, markedness comes next, and C containment, which is the requirement I had mentioned earlier as the requirement for the base to be an immediate constituent inside the derivative, that is ranked at the bottom. So just to give you a sense of what the data looks like, you have in 11 I think there are some 7 pairs of derivatives. So they are grouped by identical, they all have, each pair of them has shares the same suffix like oid, phi, obol, and so forth. And their local bases have identical stress and identical shape. But then within each pair, the odd numbered ones, so 1, 3, and so forth, has a stress based on a remote base that allows it to satisfy a markedness constraint. So gelatin, the oid derivative of gelatin is gelatinoid, not gelatinoid. Okay, and corresponding to that fact, there is a remote base, gelatinous, which is considerably more common than the oid word, and therefore likely to be known to people. And it is the stem of that word that is apparently playing a role in the stress of gelatinoid. Compare that to paraffinoid, based on paraffin. Okay, notice that gelatin and paraffin have identical stresses, and therefore the difference between paraffinoid but gelatinoid cannot be due to the stress of the local base, but it's due rather to the fact that gelatinoid has gelatinous, whereas paraffinoid does not have paraffinous. So in the absence of an optimizing remote base, we're getting paraffinoid, a form that is faithful to its local base. Okay, so paraffinoid looks like an example of cyclic stress, but in fact it's just the absence of an optimizing remote base that causes it to be that way. And then the remaining cases are of exactly the same type. So there are ify words like humidify, based on the remote base humidity, but resinify since there is no resinity. Medicinable based on medicinal, but jettisonable because there is no other derivative. Pacification, pacificatory, I should go here. Pacificatory, this is the anatori derivative, whose stress is not based on either pacify or pacification, but rather on pacific, as opposed to classificatory. Notice the difference between pacificatory with no violation of extended lapse, but classificatory with a violation of extended lapse, due to the fact that there is no classific comparable to pacific. And the remaining other pairs, they show the exact same thing, namely an odd numbered one satisfying certain markedness constraints because it has a remote base, and an even numbered one not being able to do the same because it lacks that kind of a remote base. Okay. So if there are no, so I'm now looking, everybody aside from me okay, so I can't determine from your faces whether you are puzzled or not, so therefore I will just continue. So let me give you some details about the stress of ify from work by Juliet Stanton and myself. Some of it is in progress, some of it is available. The 2020 paper is available. Okay, so talking about ify in greater detail, the stress in these verbs must be identical to either the stress of a local base, that's going to be the word to which ify was added, or the stem of a related word, a remote base. And you select whichever base avoids violation of lapse. So humidify from humidity, which is a remote base, not from humid, which is a local base, or Germanify based on Germanic rather than the local base German. So how do we determine what is a local base? In certain cases, we look at the lexical semantics as observable from quotes that the OED gives. So in particular, the OED is citing as an example of the word Germanify. They are not German statements, but rather attempts to Germanify the loyal American opinion. So this is clearly meaning to make the loyal American opinion German-like. So clearly German then is the local base that is implicit in this formation, but the stress that is indicated by the OED and the stress that is indicated to us also by our subject is Germanified, from Germany. Okay? We compare cases like humidify and Germanify with cases like resinify, which, as I mentioned earlier, is due to the fact that there is no resinity. There's just resin. And Englishify, compare Germanify, there is no Englishify because there is no Englishity, and there are no other cognates. So just to speak more generally how we identify the local bases, we rely to a large extent on the designations in the Oxford English Dictionary. We use lexical semantics, as in the case of Germanify, and we use syntactic selectional restrictions on affixes, and I will mention that in connection to ABL a bit below. Okay, so here is how we generate some of these stresses. This is a derivational scenario because there are certain unresolved questions that are best dealt with in this derivational multi-step way of doing things. So let's say early cycles generate the stress in monomorphemic forms. This is 13A, and also in fixed stress derivatives. So these are the derivatives like iti or ik or ul, in which within the right edge of the word, you really have to have stress either fixed on the antepenal or fixed on the penal. So humidity is one of these words. It's generated, let's say it's generated first, or maybe more generally speaking, it's known to people that a word of that type exists, and if an ET word exists, then it will impose antepenultimate stress on its base. So these are generated first. The outputs of these cycles are then potential bases. And then in a second stage, we generate variable stress derivatives like the ones in E5. So at that point, we have a range of possible bases. We have the local base humid for humidify, but we also have the remote base humidity. And it's good now to, if you follow the bullets right underneath the tableau, because they will explain how we proceed in this tableau. The local base like humid and remote base like humidity, we mark them with superscripts L and R, L for local, R for remote. And the same superscripts appear as co-superscripts on the stems of the various candidates to indicate correspondence between each one of these candidates and one of the bases. Then the most important of the constraints is ident base, ident stress based derivative. And here we assume that violations of this constraint are assessed relative to the co-superscripted base. So in the first candidate, which is marked as corresponding to the local base, humidify, notice that I've changed the stress, that will then violate ident stress based derivative because we've indicated that the base of candidate A is the local base and that one has a stress somewhere else. So there are two violations, one for each one of the syllables that has changed its stress status. All right, so this is the ident stress BD violation. The lapse constraint is the lapse constraint, except that in general, so if you look towards the, so this is the fourth bullet down, this is actually an affix-specific constraint that applies to all of the Latinate words, so it evaluates only derivatives that have Latinate suffixes. I haven't mentioned that in the tableau itself. And now going back to the definition of the last constraint in this tableau, core BL, what that constraint says is that you assign a violation to any derivative whose stem corresponds to a base distinct from its local base. So this is equivalent to the principle of C containment, which is the foundational principle of the cycle, but this time reformulated as a violable constraint and located in this tableau at the bottom of the ranking. Okay, so for the moment, it's at the bottom of the ranking. We'll see that it will move up a bit when in a more complex rankings. All right, so from this architecture, we derive the fact that the fact that the candidates A and B are excluded one way or the other. A is excluded because you can't change the stress relative to the base that you're looking at. B violates laps. And C takes advantage of the presence of the remote base humidity and uses that, even though that violates core BL. So that then gives the win to what we call the pseudocyclic candidate, the one that violates core BL. So now compare the case of resinify, sorry. This is the word that lacks any optimizing remote base that would have a stress beginning with an IAM. There we only have one word, resin, that begins with a trochee. We can't change the stress of that word. That's what the top candidate shows. Resinify is bad because we violated ident stress. So given the ranking, we will be content with resinify, which is the attested stress of this word. All right, so now if you want to wonder how the rest of the English system looks like, you can look at 15, which basically looks forth to the level 2 derivatives, the Germanic derivatives, and we can see there that what is possible at level 1, that is with Latin suffixes, is not possible at level 2 with Germanic suffixes. So you can say medicinable using the remote base medicinal, but you can't say medicining. You have to say medicining at level 2. So we're going to analyze that by ranking core BL, the constraint that forces you or would like to force you to use only your local base, above all markedness constraints that are active at level 2. So without going through the detail of that, let me now talk about the fact that the relationship between remote bases like humidity and humidify and derivatives has all of the cyclic properties that I have enumerated on the first page, with the exception of C containment. So first of all, there is systematic and surface similarity between the remote base and the derivative. We see that in medicinal and medicinable, in that pair. The stress is predictable in the remote base. So it's like as if the remote base was a first cycle. So you can predict the stress of medicinal given the fact that it contains the suffix "al." So you can look back at what he said in 13a on this point. The relationship between the remote base and the derivative is asymmetric in the sense that medicinable is accentually marked, although it is less marked than a form faithful to the local base medicine would have been. And it is accentually marked because it needs to preserve its similarity to its own base, which is the remote base medicinal. So let me just illustrate that point. If you look at the tableau for medicinable with, I'm just looking here at the winning candidate under C. That one is marked as corresponding to the stem of medicinal, the remote base. They have identical stress and therefore this is satisfied. Notice that the lapse, we're getting a lapse violation, a couple of lapse violations here. In fact, we're getting an extended lapse violation. And that is still better than being faithful to the local base, which would have given us medicinable with 3 lapse violations and in fact 2 extended lapse violations. But so it's better to be faithful to medicinal than to be faithful to medicine, which is a local base. And whether you are faithful to medicine or medicinal, you can't get the ideal stress pattern, which is the one shown in A. So medicinable, that one has ideal satisfaction of lapse. And in this particular case, satisfaction of core BL, because we choose to co-index this with a local based medicine, but that one has violations of ident stress. And the same thing would be true if if we were to modify the stress of the remote base. Okay, so this is all of this is to show that the properties of cyclic inheritance are found here too, and that the only departure from a cyclic pattern in this case is that medicinal is not a local base of the able word. And it's not a local base because it's not syntactically contained in medicinable. We know that because able words in English require a transitive verb as their base. And medicinal is not a transitive verb. It's not a verb at all. So, so we know that the local base is the verb to medicine. Able has that one as its local base, but it adopts the stress of somebody else. Okay. All right, so let me say something more general about English stress before I leave this topic. Stanton and I checked the predictions of this type of analysis against all 27 Latin derivative types of English, focusing on those in which accentual satisfaction of accentual markedness and faithfulness to the local base conflict. That is, if you are faithful to the local base, you're going to get more violations of markedness. If you are not faithful to the local base, you will get fewer. So we checked on those. Our sources were the stresses inferred from the transcriptions in the online OED, the recordings of online OED, and we checked as much as possible on various online sources, including English. And the result of the global report, the report of the global results is given in a paper that we gave at LabFun. I'm just going to present a couple of cases to indicate what we found. In 17A, I am giving you the distribution of lapse violations among E5 verbs that have trochaic or dactylic local bases. So in these cases, you're going to get a lapse violation if you're faithful to the local base, and if you have a remote base that gives you better stress, that has iambic stress, then you might be able to escape that. So the vast majority of E5 verbs do have a better remote base, that is a remote base whose beginning is iambic, like Germanic or rigidity. And all but 2 of these adopt the stress of the remote base. So Germanic, Germanify, rigidity, rigidify. 2 of them deviate from this pattern. Of the forms in E5 that do not have a remote base, there are 5 such words, and all of them preserve the stress without the stress of the local base without changing it. Okay. And this is significant. And then we did the same thing with the E-nouns. The E-nouns have primary stress on the final syllable, and they tend to cause sometimes a reversal of stress to avoid clash and to avoid a violation of the rhythm rule. The rhythm rule is what happens at the word level in the case of 13 men. In this case, the picture is somewhat noisier, but the trends are identical. Namely, if you do have an optimizing remote base, and that remote base is going to be trochaic or will have primary prominence on the first syllable, like ordination or transportation, those are remote bases of the E verbs, then you will tend to adopt the stress of that, and that happens in 12 of the 25 cases. In 13 others, that doesn't happen, but there are, so in cases like, so you have provocation, but also, so that's a possible remote base. So you would expect, based on provocation, that you will also get provoquee. Provoquee is attested in the OED as a UK form. For American English, we've only found provokee was a violation of the of clash and the rhythm rule. The much more frequent pattern is found among the 76 forms that do not have an optimizing remote base. So in those cases, we're getting, in the vast majority of them, we're getting forms like divorcee rather than divorcee. So generalizing then, so we've seen that in these two cases, for these two Latinate derivatives, we are getting the results roughly with some noise that the model predicts. We can generalize to just get a picture of the entire lexicon of English. So there are three types of suffixes. There are the Latinate level 1 suffixes that have a fixed right mode stress, like it, all, or us. So that's one type. Those will always get that stress. Then there are the pseudocyclic suffixes, which are the vast majority at level 1. So abol, eri, ishan, ifai, and so forth. So all of these abide by our model in the sense that if there is a remote base, you will tend to follow the stress of the remote base rather than violate markedness and be faithful to the local base. And then finally, at level 2, core BL becomes active in the sense that level 1 derivatives are Latinate derivatives for the evaluation of which constraints indexed for the Latinate vocabulary are relevant. So constraints like lapse Latinate or extended lapse Latinate are relevant. So for all of these markedness constraints, they outrank core BL, and therefore they can be satisfied at the expense of core BL. But core BL outranks the general markedness constraints, the ones that are not indexed to a particular affix, like extended lapse. And this is our characterization of the level 2 pattern. So then what I suggest here is that it is possible to give a unified analysis of level 1 and level 2 cyclic and pseudocyclic derivatives, in part because we have located core BL, which is the violable formulation of C containment. We have located at an intermediate point in the hierarchy below certain markedness constraints and above certain other markedness constraints. And that is our account of the English stress cycle. Okay, so Juliet and I have attempted to check the productivity of the model, that is the productivity of this model in which markedness constraints are outranked by faithfulness to the base, but core BL is at the bottom. So we try to verify this in a mechanical Turk study where we tested subject preferences in nonce Latinate EFI and E forms. So the stimuli were evenly divided between the ones that had potential optimizing remote bases, like let's say an EFI verb based on moral, which could benefit from the potential remote base morality, in which case it will be moralify. So we were testing whether that will be also the preference of our subjects. And there were other nonce derivatives that did not have the possibility of a remote base. So choral does not have an equivalent ET noun, so there is no chorality, and we were predicting that subjects will like choralify less than they might like moralify, and indeed we found roughly those results was again with certain noise and associated with the E derivative, but overall the predictions were confirmed. Okay, so stopping here for a second to give you all a chance to say anything, since I cannot read your faces. All right. All right, so I am then going to talk about pseudocyclic inheritance beyond English. And here I will just announce that there are comparable patterns found in lots of languages beyond English, that is cognate words that distinct from the local base of a derivative that are being recruited to improve the markedness score of that derivative in a bunch of languages. I want to mention one of these cases because it serves as an illustration of the relationship between the various patterns that I opened with on the first page of this handout. and standard cyclicity. So I want to talk about stress in Ukrainian derived adjectives. This is work with Igor Yanovich. So here is the outline. In any adjective, the stress of the adjective is, if the adjective is derived from a noun, is the stress of the adjective is based on the stress of some case number inflected forms of the base noun. So not a specific case number form, but some of them. In fact, any such inflected form is good enough, the nominative singular, the nominative plural, the genitive plural, and so forth, and conceivably other derivatives of the noun, but we're not sure about that. And so we're finding that possible correlation, and here is a distribution. Let me say a bit more before we get to the distribution. So you have to know, to understand the pattern of Ukrainian, you have to know the markedness preferences in simple words. And the top preferred stress pattern is stress on the penultimate. This is Western Ukrainian, neighbor of Polish, which has penultimate stress. Next, most preferred is antepenult stress, and then least preferred is final stress. And anything else than those two stresses occurs only in suffixed words that remain faithful to their base. So anything else is ruled out in simple words. Okay, so simple words can be accentually mobile in their declension. So the word for melon alternates as harbuz in the plural, but harbuzı, so harbuz in the singular, harbuzı in the plural. And a more interesting alternation, which will be relevant here, is the word for orphan, which represents a larger class, sirota, nominative singular, sirotu, nominative plural, sirit, genitive plural. So as you can see, we're getting three stress patterns on the stem. The stem is completely stressless in sirota, stressed on the initial in sirotu, and stress on the final in sirit. And the last possibility is that simple nouns can be invariant, as in cactus, cactus, cactus. Okay. So here is, now with this introduction, we can see how the nominal adjectives get their stress depending on the pattern of stress mobility in the declension of the base noun. So we can summarize the mechanism as follows. Select as the base, for purposes of stressing the base, any case form of the base noun that yields penultimate stress in the adjective. So the examples are for A and B. So in harbuz, you have nominative singular harbuz, nominative plural harbuzı with a completely stressless stem. Now for a disyllabic suffix like ovi, the best stress comes from the plural, and that's indeed what we get. We're getting harbuzovi, okay, with the unstressed stem coming from the plural. In the case of a monosyllabic suffix, like the one in skui, okay, so let's suppose that we add that one to a base like sirata, sirate, sirit, okay, the best stress is provided by the genitive plural, and that is because that will give us penultimate stress in the adjective. And indeed, that's what we're getting. We're getting siritski, okay? And then we can tell from the vowel that that vowel is the vowel that occurs in the genitive plural. Then, okay, so this is the first option. If you can get penultimate stress in the adjective while being faithful to some inflected case form of the base noun, do so. Otherwise, if you don't have the ability to generate penultimate stress in the adjective, select as the base the case form that yields antepenultimate stress. And you can see that in C and D. So professor, okay, that is nominative singular. Professora, nominative plural. There is no case form of the base noun which has stress on the final. So there is no professor. So therefore the optimal penultimate stress is unattainable, but we can get antepenultimate stress in professorski, and that is good enough. And similarly, in pastielevui, okay, that one is based on the nominative plural, the stress pattern of the nominative plural, pastieli, okay, rather than a nominative singular postil. Okay, postil would be would give us a pre-antepenultimate stress, which is not good. Next step, if you can't obtain in a way that is faithful to one form of the base, either penultimate or antepenultimate stress, then just take whatever case forms are on offer, and that happens in cactus. Cactus is invariant. You can get cactus and cactus, and whether you add a monosyllabic or a disyllabic suffix, you get the same stress. For instance, cactusovy, which displays a stress that's otherwise unattested in Ukrainian. Okay, and now the interesting last two cases, if you have two distinct case forms in the base noun that yield equally good stress in the adjective, so either both of them yield penultimate stress or both of them yield antepenultimate stress, and there is no better option. And one of these two case forms is a nominative singular, then take that. And that's the example in F and in G. So nominative singular balota, genitive plural balit. Notice that they both have stress on the final syllable of the stem, as opposed to balata, which doesn't have that stress. So balotnei has as good a stress as balitnei would have, but balotnei comes from, clearly, given the vowel quality, from the nominative singular. So that is then the form. And conversely, if the vowel changes in the nominative singular, and that one is the optimal form, as in Yaversky, that one, you will be able to tell that the form has, that the form that represents the base for the derivative is the nominative singular. So in this case, compare Yaver with Yavora. They are both getting stress on the initial syllable of the stem, but one of them is a nominative singular and the other one isn't, and it's a nominative singular that is being selected. Okay, so here is the pattern, here is the mechanism by which we're going to generate this pattern. As in the analysis of English, we are distinguishing some early cases from some of the later cases. So we're generating bases and remote bases, local bases, all of the bases at earlier stages. And in this particular case, what I want to emphasize is the fact that the early cycles in the pseudocyclic analysis, they have all of the properties of standard cycles. That is, you are productively generating stress patterns in this case, case number inflected simple nouns. So the generation of the nominative singular in the sirota, that reflects the fact that this root is underlyingly specified as being unstressed. The stress of the nominative plural siroti, that reflects the fact that the plural stem must be distinct from the singular. And the final stress in sirita reflects a rule which requires null endings, like the 0 of the genitive plural, to impose root final stress and to turn the final vowel into E. So all of these are general properties of Ukrainian. And so, as I mentioned in the handout, some of the steps are restricted to the mobile noun class, but within each class, the stress is predictable. Okay. So given these forms that have been generated, the denominal adjectives are being generated in a second step using all of the information available from the full inflectional paradigm of the base noun. So in addition, I'm going to assume that the nominative singular is the local base. And I'm assuming that to keep things relatively simple, and also because there is perhaps evidence, syntactic evidence, that the nominative is less marked syntactically than the other case forms, and that the singular is less marked than the plural. So let's assume that the nominative singular is on syntactic markedness grounds the local base. And then if that's true, then different non-nominative singular case forms are remote bases. And since there are many of them, I'm going to number them to keep them distinct from each other. So here is how we generate Siritsky. This is the adjective meaning pertaining to an orphan from the paradigm Sirota, Sirotu, and Sirit. with sirata representing the local basin, skui representing a monosyllabic suffix. So we try to satisfy core BL, the lowest ranked of all of the constraints. But if we do satisfy core BL, we either end up not being able to satisfy the set of constraints that are giving us penultimate stress. So that will give us sirat skui, or it will give us a violation of ident stress if we shift the stress from the, if we assign stress to the stem, as in sirotsky. Okay, that's a fatal violation of ident stress. Or we can use some stress pattern from a case form other than the genitive plural. So let's say the nominative plural, this would be the remote base 1. Siratsky, that also violates stress penal because the stress is in fact the antipenal. So the optimal option is to adopt the stress of the genitive plural, which is sirit, and that gives us siritsky, with a violation of core BL, but satisfaction of all of the others. So this can be also seen by comparing siritsky, which is obtaining optimal penultimate stress, with suboptimal professorsky with antepenultimate stress, okay? And that's because there is no professor accentual allomorph. Okay? So professorsky satisfies is identical to the stress to the accentual allomorph of professor. It violates the lower rank constraint among the markedness constraints that I'm grouping under stress penal, and it doesn't violate core BL. If we assign professorsky using one of the remote bases, we violate non-finality. If we decide to stress the penalt, that will be in violation of ident stress. So B and C are eliminated in that way. And then finally, cactusove. This is the worst stress of all of them. That is due to the fact that cactus, that gives you no option except cactus. And so, I mean, all of the other inflected forms of cactus keep the stress in the same place, so I didn't list them. So the only option is to violate stress penalt, in fact, to violate it multiple times because stress penalt involves multiple markedness constraints, or to violate ident stress, and under the ranking, it's better to violate the markedness constraint. So now here is the most interesting component of this pattern. I mentioned earlier that there could be syntactic reasons to take the nominative singular as representing the local base, that is the form that is syntactically, at least, if not morphologically, embedded within other case forms. So this is now following work by Zaha and other people who are syntacticians who are assuming that the nominative singular is in fact syntactically embedded, if not its exponents, inside the other case forms. So if that is true, then that will explain the fact that if you have a choice of multiple bases, one of which are equally good from the point of view of stress, but one of which represents a nominative singular, you choose that. So balotny is the example of that, comparing balota, that's a nominative singular, with balit, genitive plural. So balotny and balitny, they are equally good with respect to ident stress and stress penalt, but not equally good with respect to core BL. And that is what determines the choice in this case. Okay, so I will now summarize the significance of this pattern. So like English, this case has properties of cyclic inheritance. Namely, it displays a surface similarity between lexically related forms, not predicted by the simple grammar of the language, which I refer to as G sub S. So the similarities, for instance, observed in the case of cactusove, this is not predicted by the grammar of simple forms because simple forms will never get penultimate stress. The Ukrainian also shows an asymmetry between bases and derivatives in that the stress in inflected nouns is predictable from the root underlying representation and from stress constraints that are specific to the accentual class of the noun. Whereas the stress in the derivative, so in other words, the stress in inflected nouns is predictable from considerations that are completely independent of the derivatives, whereas the stress in derivatives is predictable from the stress of the inflected forms of the base noun, okay, outranking stress preferences. But of course, if you can satisfy both of them, you do. Okay, so these are the ways in which this is comparable to cyclic inheritance. But unlike in cases of cyclic inheritance, C containment is not satisfied here, in that at least some derivatives, like Siritsky, which is, if you remember, this is based on the genitive plural, the form, both the stress and the segmentals of the genitive plural of the word for orphan, those derivatives do not contain their base. That is, the word pertaining to an orphan does not contain the genitive plural of orphans. So in this case, quite interestingly, we do observe, unlike in the English Latinate cases, a low-ranked base preference that is perhaps identical to Corbiel. You prefer to be identical to the nominative or the nominative singular, all else being equal, but that is just a tiebreaker in this case. Okay. I will skip now to 27 because I think we're going to be running short. We will soon be running out on time.
Yeah, there's a clarification question.
Yes.
Yes, So Miyagaru from Kansai University asked whether Ukrainian words in how many Ukrainian words in 22 are loan words, and he thinks
yes,
are loan words.
So many of them are loan words, but not all of them are loan words.
Right.
So, and I can. So actually, if you go to my website, you can find the paper. And the paper has lexical statistics and lots of examples. And I can also be of some assistance because I learned some Ukrainian in the process, so I can tell. But no, professor is indeed, as you figured out, a loan word, but it's not generally the case that only loan words are in this category.
So the stress patterns are indifferent to their loan words or not?
No, I wouldn't go as far as that. So my sense is that, as in many other languages, the loan words are leaving an imprint on Ukrainian, in the sense that you find patterns that deviate from the preference for penalt or anti-penalt stress quite frequently among the loan words. However, even so, loan words that I have not seen a simple loan word with pre-antepenultimate stress. So in that respect, the stress pattern of native Ukrainian asserts itself. So in native words, you do have this hierarchy of preferred stresses: penultimate better than antepenultimate, and antepenultimate better than final, and you find nothing else. And among the loan words, I have not seen once pre-antepenultimate stress in unsuffixed words.
Yeah, that was the end of the question. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Steriade.
Thank you. Seunghun and Shigeto, I see that it is an hour since I began to talk. I don't want to prevent people from, so I can summarize the rest of the talk and in such a way that I allow people to speak. Or I can go on. I mean, you guys should give me some guidance as to what I do.
Perhaps if all the main points are addressed, maybe you can make a decision. Like if it's better to for us to know the next is Romanian, right? Romanian facts.
No, I won't be talking about. Oh, I mean, I don't think I will get to Romanian. I think I will skip the Romanian and the Latin part, and the only question is whether I talk about paradigm distinctness, which will take us closer to 9:30. Well, 9:30 Boston time.
Personally, I like to hear about paradigm distinctiveness.
Right, okay. I also be interested in hearing that, and then we can have question and answer session.
Okay, all right, so let's do that. Okay. All right, so I wanted to Right. Okay. So then I will just assert something that. So I'm interested in pursuing the question of whether the patterns are productive. So whether these pseudocyclic patterns are productive, and I started a project with a former MIT student, Margarita Misier-Pashaeva, who did a project on pseudocyclic patterns in Russian stress. Russian stress is in some way similar to Ukrainian. So she looked at the subject preferences for nonce-denominal patronymic nouns. So these are names that are based, these are invented names based on various actual words. And the question was whether the range of accentual allomorphs is in fact, as we suspected based on the literature found, depends on whether the range of accentual allomorphs depends on the declension of the base noun. And we found some of that. There were also results that contradicted that. So we hope to go back to this project very soon. But just to tell you that I'm interested in the question of whether these patterns are productive, because if they're not productive, then that casts some doubt on whether they exist or do not. All right, so I want to mention a second of the 5 phenomena I started out with. There is a particular one that is important to me, and that is paradigm distinctness. And then I will summarize what happens in the rest of the talk, and we can have questions. A paradigm is a set of exponents of inflected forms of the same lexeme. They share in exclusivity some syntactic features like tense or aspect or combinations of these. And distinctness is a requirement that the members of that set should be pairwise distinct, or they should be distinct with respect to a specific property. They can be, the requirement can either be that they should be distinct in their entirety, so the words should not be identical, or that the stems should be pairwise distinct. So in particular in Ukrainian, there is this requirement that the singular stem and the plural stem cannot be accentually identical. So that would be an example of 30b. So there is an effective paradigm distinctness that has been studied by Katya Pertsova in a recent article. The phenomenon was known from a long time, and basically you can see it in 31. The phenomenon is that the genitive plural is preferably a null suffix, except when it is blocked by identical to the 0 suffix of the nominative singular, in which case it's something else. So here is the data. The nominative singular is predictable from gender. It's 0 if it's masculine, it's I if it's feminine, and O if it's neuter. And the genitive plural has multiple allomorphs, 0 or of or a, but prefers, across genders, prefers the 0. However, you can't have a 0 if the nominative singular is already a 0. So you can see examples of the 3 simple cases in 32b. So nominative stol, 0 nominative singular suffix, genitive plural stalov with, you cannot have stol 0, that would be identical to the nominative singular. Feminine rieka, but genitive plural riek. Here you can have a 0 suffix because it's not, it cannot be confused with the nominative singular. Neuter slovo, okay, genitive plural slov. Again, 0 is possible here because the nominative singular contains a suffix. So now, proving that this is in fact a case of homophony avoidance, you can see that even in the masculine, if the nominative singular is for idiosyncratic reasons something other than 0, then you get 0 in the genitive plural. So the word for citizen contains an extra suffix in the singular. It's grajdanin. That's a suffix of the singular. In the plural, that suffix is never present, and therefore the genitive plural can be grajdan. Okay. Or in the case of nouns whose singular frequency is either 0 or negligible. So at the beginning of the 20th century, the word gram was only used in multiple, referring to multiple grams. And therefore the nominative singular was not used. At that point, gram with 0, meaning genitive plural, was usable. As physics developed in the Soviet Union, the nominative singular was used, and then gram genitive plural disappeared. Okay, so here is a summary of what Pertsova says in her analysis. I didn't change it because I basically, the ideas are hers. Prefer 0 to the genitive plural exponent. So I will call that constraint 0 in the genitive plural. Paradigm distinctness, assign a violation if a member of the nominal paradigm is identical to the nominative singular. And that can be generalized in a way that is explained in footnote 3. And the ranking is paradigm distinctness above the preference for the 0 in the genitive plural. So given the ranking, and given that a nominative singular is stall, you have to choose Stalov. But given the same ranking, and given that the nominative singular of Grajdanin is Grajdanin, containing a singular, a suffix limited to the singular, then the genitive plural can be Grajdan rather than Grajdanov. Okay. So this is clearly a case in which there is an asymmetry between the base and the derivative, in the sense that the nominative singular is determined independently of any case number form by gender marking factors and lexical properties of individual nouns, whereas the genitive plural exponent is determined entirely by reference to the nominative singular. That is, the affixal preference for a 0 suffix in the genitive plural is violated to keep it distinct from the nominative singular. The nominative singular is whatever it is. This is not a case of C containment. So I will go about it in 2 ways. First, I started out this project with the idea that a nominative singular is clearly not contained in the genitive plural in a morphological sense, because the exponents of the nominative singular are not contained in the genitive plural. But there are syntacticians who believe that syntactically speaking, the nominative singular is in fact, or the nominative is in fact contained in other cases. So to satisfy them, I assumed that the opposite is true, that in fact the nominative singular is present inside the genitive plural. So let's assume that, and suppose that the genitive plural structure is a root followed by an affix of the nominative singular, followed by an affix of the genitive plural. Okay. So then if that is correct, then we could be rewriting the condition on paradigm distinctness as I've done it here in 36. So you could say star 0, 0, you cannot have 2 0 exponents of distinct case number features that co-occur in a row. So you can't have the 0 of the nominative singular followed by the 0 of the genitive plural. So that could be the constraint. So if that's a correct constraint, we don't need to talk about the base in paradigm distinctness. And then this entire data set is irrelevant to the question of whether base derivative asymmetries derive from C containment. So let's consider this constraint. This constraint does generate Stalov as better than stall as a genitive plural. And that is because if you try to have stall as a genitive plural, the structure is going to be stall 0 for the nominative singular, and then 0 here for the genitive plural, and that violates the 0, 0 constraint. So clearly Stalov with 0 for the nominative singular, but O for the genitive plural is better than that. Okay, so this is getting us off the ground. But the same constraint doesn't generate genitive plural riek or genitive plural grajda. So in the case, so if you have under the exact same assumptions, the 0 of the genitive plural on the outside of the nominative singular exponent, that will predict rieka as the genitive plural of the feminine. And similarly, in the case of Grajdan, if the nominative singular Grajdanin is contained inside the genitive plural, then that will give us Grajdanin and not Grajdan. And if you say, well, that's not true because in is not a nominative singular ending, it's a singulative suffix, then the alternative is that it will predict Grajdanov because 0 followed by 0 is again ruled out. Okay, so what I've shown then is that the right paradigm distinctness condition cannot be derived from C containment. Rather, it must compare surface pairs of forms, and it must decide which one of them doesn't change. The form that doesn't change is the base. That is by definition in all of these cases. So, and the asymmetry between the base and the derivative is that the base doesn't change, but the derivative has to change to satisfy the similarity or the dissimilarity requirement. And it's conceivable that the nominative singular is syntactically contained in other case forms, but that fact is not helping us because its surface exponents are not contained. So Grajdanin is not contained in Grajdan. So for purpose of deriving base derivative asymmetries in paradigm distinctness cases, C containment doesn't help. We must compare surface forms that sometimes don't contain each other and determine which one changes. Okay, so there is a study of the productivity of paradigm distinctness. It has been done by a student at University of Toronto. I've seen a summary of the study. He has not tested whether the nominative singular gets priority relative to other paradigm members, but he has determined that speakers of Russian can be taught a system that tests whether they are in fact sensitive to the avoidance of paradigm homophones, and they are. They prefer paradigms that are uniform, but not paradigms that are uniform and contain homophony. So that this is for Russian speakers. So this is sort of interesting. And I noticed here that there has been work on paradigm distinctness done by Larry Chimura back in 2006 on Japanese, which is unfortunately, I don't know if it has been pursued. It was quite interesting when I first read it. Okay, let me skip to 41 to observe that the selection of the base is similar across some of the phenomena that we've discussed here. So the nominative singular is the base in stem. So we've observed that in Russian, it's the base in stem dissimilarity cases, in the cases of paradigm distinctness cases. It's also the base in certain stem similarity cases, cases of paradigm uniformity, where the nominative singular is the base in Polish or in ancient Greek. And in cases of pseudocyclic identity, we've just talked about a case in which the nominative singular is the base in Ukrainian and in Russian, in the sense that derivatives prefer to resemble the stress of the nominative singular than of the stress of other case forms. So that suggests that there is a single set of preferences for bases that operates across all of the phenomena that are discussed. Okay, so I will do the following now. I will go to the conclusions of this talk, and then if people are interested, you can ask me questions about the stuff that I haven't covered. And in that way, you will be able to escape at some point this session. So I'm now on page 12 in the summary. So I declare that all of the 5 of the stem dissimilarity patterns that I had listed in the beginning in 1 display predictability effects. That is, the properties that are being transferred from the base to the derivative are predictable within the base. And they also display asymmetries between the base and the derivatives. And although I haven't talked about this, and you won't find this in the handout, there is evidence of recursive evaluations of similarity and dissimilarity in some of these phenomena, in the sense that you decide on how to structure a certain derivative, and then there is yet another derivative and yet another derivative that is structured in the same way successively. So that is a property of cyclicity, of cyclic inheritance, but it is also found in paradigm uniformity, paradigm distinctness, and morphemic identity. So now in cyclic inheritance cases, predictability, asymmetry, and recursiveness they can be derived from C containment. But C containment doesn't hold in the other patterns. So it doesn't hold in paradigm distinctness, it doesn't hold in pseudocyclicity, and although I haven't shown it, it doesn't hold in paradigm uniformity. Or it holds just in the sense that it is a violable preference, as we've seen in a number of these cases. Or if it does hold in a syntactic sense, it doesn't derive the base derivative asymmetry effect, as we've just seen in Russian. Okay. So then it doesn't seem wise to attribute instances of predictability, asymmetry, and recursiveness to C containment, because even in the standard cyclic cases where C containment holds, the independently needed core BL constraint is sufficient to do that. Okay. Okay, and then the last thing that we've seen is that base selection converges on the same categories like the nominative singular for distinct patterns of stem dissimilarity or stem similarity. And that suggests that there are general mechanisms that underlie all of the phenomena in one, not just cyclicity. And the factors look comparable across the cases considered, but details remain unclear. And I will be grateful for any help with this project. And I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now, thank you, Donca. And now if you have a question, please send me a name and affiliation. You do not need to send the question itself. The first question comes from Professor Haruo Kubozono at Ninja. Please unmute yourself and ask questions.
Okay, thank you, Donca, for your very interesting talk. I have a very naive question about base selection. Let's look at some examples. Say 13, this should be familiar to everybody. The humidity, humidify example.
Yes.
Through your talk, you're assuming that you have every words, every derived words related to the target word in the input. But the dictionary of a language should be different from the mental lexicon of individual people. So for example, one person, some people know both inputs, humid and humidity, but others may not know humidity, although they know humid. Then does this analysis make a prediction that for the second type of people, speakers, B here, humidify will be chosen as the winner? This relates to second language acquisition. Yeah, that's my question.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so I shared my screen. I now moved from the place where you wanted me to go to item 19, which is the study with Juliet Stanton that was meant to test precisely this prediction. So I spoke a little bit fast about it. So that there were two phases in this study. Number one, there was a preference among two different pronunciations of a nonce word, like moralify, either moralify or moralify. That's okay. So then in the first stage, the subjects said one or they preferred one or the other. And then in the second stage, the subjects were tested on whether they knew the word that would have licensed in our hypothesis, the stress shift in moralify. So it was so yes, indeed, there is a correlation between knowledge of the potential remote base and the judgment of well-formedness in the subject. So this was the best that we could do. I want to mention that Kenan Bryce is here. I mean, I see his dog as one of the icons of the among the participants. Yes, he has just raised his thumb. So he has related work that I wanted to mention because it's very much on the question of whether the subjects are in fact memorizing the stress pattern of some of these words that I claim to be pseudocyclic, or whether, like humidify is common enough that you could memorize it, okay? But we're claiming that even though humidify itself could be memorized, in the general case, there is a pattern that people know in the abstract way, independently of the words that carry it. And that is, to some extent, verified in the study that Juliet Stanton and I did. And I think that Kenan is also in the process of verifying this for Spanish.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so
and I think actually I should say more. He has verified some of this for English. So yes, I should have mentioned that as well.
So you don't need to change the grammar. I mean the constraint
the grammar
ranking.
Is the same. Yes, it's a lexicon. That the lexicon is going to be different depending on the words that people have happened to learn.
But with the same grammar, the same ranking.
That's what we're claiming. This is the dangerous thing to say, right? Because I would expect that if the lexicon is fundamentally different, then of course the grammar is going to be somewhat different. But if the lexicon is marginally different, and it's possible for the grammar to be largely the same, but of course people's judgments about individual words may very well differ.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next question comes from, in fact, Kenan Bryce from UCLA.
There he is. Okay.
Hi, Donca. Thank you very much for this really, really fascinating talk. I had a question about, on point 18, if you wouldn't mind scrolling up a little bit. This is like very nitpicky, but I wasn't sure exactly what you meant. So when you say we have a distinction between Latinate level 1 suffixes like ity and us, or pseudocyclic stress, do you mean that, are you proposing that there's a distinction about the quality of the affix itself that says either I pay attention to the possible remote bases or I don't? Or is it simply that for cases that are affixed with ity and us, etc., there don't happen to exist advantageous remote bases, and so we couldn't see any pseudocyclicity that might be there? Would you mind just saying a little more?
So I mean actually a third thing. So what I mean is that there are certain constraints that are indexed to specific affixes, like extended lapse right for ity, and similarly extended lapse right for us and all, and that's about it. So generally, extended lapse right is violable in the Latinate vocabulary of English, as seen by able words.
Yeah.
And extended lapse in general is violable as seen by all of the Latinate derivatives. But there are certain suffixes that require a stress somewhere in the accentual window of the last 3 syllables, and ity is one of them. So that constraint, which mentions these 3 or 4 suffixes, that is at the top of the ranking, and in particular outranks base derivative faith. So for the sake of that constraint, you are going to shift the stress of the base. So this is, for instance, take any, okay, yes, so take the name Kawahara, and you can turn that into an adjective, Kawaharian. Okay, now unfortunately the stress remains in the same place for, okay, but I'm now, I'm not coming up with the appropriate thing, but okay, yes, Wittgenstein, initial stress, but Wittgensteinian last stress because stress shifts here before the Ian. So these are special affixes. The majority of the Latinate affixes, the ones that are mentioned in the second line of 18, they don't have particular properties. They only have the property of being Latinate, which requires them to satisfy certain constraints like lapse, possibly at the expense of core BL. So they are different in that way from the general markedness constraints, which are, I'm assuming that the general markedness constraints make an appearance in level 2 and also in simple monomorphemic words.
Okay, I see. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next question is from Shigeto Kawahara, Keio University.
All right. I have one specific question and one general question. Now that we are on 18, I wanted to say something about the experiment that you report in 19. So
Yes.
would it be possible that, suppose that subjects do not know morality,
Yes.
then the prediction is they'd say moralify first.
That's
But
what we
if
predict.
you teach them that there is a word morality, then
Yes.
the same, they will give different stress to the same word. Is that the experiment you did, or?
No, we didn't do that. What we did was to present the word in two pronunciations, so two variants, moralify and moralify, make them choose.
Mhm.
And then after they had chosen, they were asked, do you know the word?
I see.
That's all. So of course, so if you know the word morality, you know how to stress it. And that's because ET has predictable stress. So there is no question where you're going to put your stress if you know the word morality. Morality is maybe not the best example because, of course, everybody knows morality, but the examples there were somewhat less frequent cases, non-existent cases like chorality, and we didn't teach them anything. We just checked what it is that they knew already.
So that experiment, in a sense, tests the correlation between the presence of the remote base, right? But if you can teach the remote base, that can kind of address the causality.
That is correct. So let me ask Kanan, whose dog at least seems to still be here, if I'm not sure that Kanan followed that procedure in his experiments, but let me ask him if he has followed that.
It's actually not my dog. It's a dog I saw at a coffee shop. I really wish it was my dog.
It looks like a very nice dog, but so did you
anyway, sorry.
have data
Yes.
to bear on Shigeto's question?
Yes, well, sort of. So what I did is I didn't actually ask people, I didn't teach people the relevant remote base, but I did ask people whether they know the remote base or the local base, and then later on kind of reclassified on an individual participant level, whether for that person, the word moral was of a type which had a remote base or of a type that did not have a remote base. So if the person indicated they did not know morality, I would say, okay, in this case, moral, I should act like coral for that person. And so I ran a model, I modeled the results like Donca did, and I found that, of course, knowing the relevant remote base predicts increased preference for stress shift. But even if you, I think this might get at your question a little bit, even if you look only at bases for which there is, only at local bases for which there is a remote base in the OED, regardless of whether someone knows it, including the subject's indication of whether they knew the remote base or not, even examining only that subset, you still find that knowledge of the remote base predicts their preference. So I didn't quite go as far as to teach them, but I did find that even if you look at only at words that do have a remote base in general, whether or not a subject knows the remote base is still playing a role. Does that answer the question you hoped for, Donca?
I think so. Your voice broke on occasion, but I think that yes, in general, you did answer me, and I don't know if you answered Shigeto's question, but I'm assuming that you did.
Yeah, it's not so much an answer, a question. It was like you argue.
Yeah, it's a good suggestion for future work because as Shigeto correctly points out that one can tighten the connection, the causal connection between knowledge of the remote base and a certain accentual behavior, right? You can change the state of knowledge of the subject in a deliberate way and see then whether their stress pattern differs. So I've been asked to do this. So Jennifer Cole at LabFun asked us to do that, and yeah, I guess we have to do it.
But Juliet can do it, I guess.
Yes, Juliet is a busy woman, and yeah, but yes, we should do this. Thank you very much.
Seunghun, do you have other people lining up?
At this point, no. So if you have more questions, you can follow up.
Yeah, this is a very general question, and I guess relates to one of the points that I made in my introduction. So I guess the whole point of this proposal is that we are now talking about the set of existing words, right? That matters.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And there's this fundamental idea in generative phonology, which is that phonological knowledge is a knowledge about a set of possible words, not existing words.
Actually, so yes, I see what you're saying. I see what
Yeah,
you're
so
saying.
right. You have thoughts about this general. I don't know if there's any particular issues, but
there is an issue. Obviously, there is an issue. So this is a very good point. So yeah, I get asked this question by Alec Marantz,
okay.
and now by you. And so yes, so okay, so notice that it's not actually what I've done here. If you, let's go through the derivation of some of the English cases. Let me go back to, to 13. So what is unpredictable? So the sense in which you have to know something about existing words is that you don't always know whether a particular Latinate word of English will have an ET derivative or an S derivative.
Right.
But once you know that, you know its stress. So this is, so I still want to say that the stress, which is the important property that's transferred from the base to the derivative in these cases, that's a predictable property, okay? But it's true that we are banking here on the idea that this predictable property is, well, sometimes, whether you have it instantiated in a particular word, that really depends on whether you know that there is a certain suffix or there isn't a certain suffix. So I've been thinking about how to claim something stronger, which is that to a large extent, you are in fact able to predict whether a word will take an ET derivative or will not take an ET derivative. So ET in particular is very difficult to predict because you have a closed class, a closed set of morphemes to which ET can be attached. Okay, so clearly you have to memorize all of those, right? But in other cases, perhaps it is possible to predict in some ways whether a word will have a certain type of Latinate derivative or not. So let me give you an example. Every adjective in id can have an EDT derivative, okay? So humid is an adjective in id. Druid is an adjective in id. Humidity exists. Druidity doesn't exist, but druidity is really a good word because it ends in id. So if you, insofar as you know, there can be islands of predictability in the kind of the mixed picture of the Latinate set of words. And you can predict that, even though in general, you might not know whether a particular word does or doesn't take an ET, there will be certain words that take ET for sure. Okay, we haven't yet tested whether invented adjectives in id give rise to shifted stress edify, but I would expect if they are adjectives, they should be able to do that. Okay, so my intuition is that we are not talking about attested words, but rather possible words. And that occasionally the set of possible words is in some ways limited in arbitrary ways, and the speaker knows that. But the speaker also knows the general stuff about the laws of the language that predict certain words will exist even if he hasn't heard them before. And I've actually tested that over the summer on Romanian. I haven't talked about Romanian pseudocyclic derivatives, but it's the land of pseudocyclicity. I mean, everything is pseudocyclic. And I've tested over the summer exactly this question, whether a word that you've never heard before and whose properties you can infer indirectly from knowledge of the ways in which morphology would apply to that word, whether that would yield pseudocyclic effects using remote bases that you've never heard before, but remote bases that can be inferred. And we got some results in that way.
I see. Okay. That's very, very interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome.
We have another question from Professor Kubozono from Lincoln.
Okay. I heard your talk wondering if your analysis can be applied to Japanese accent patterns. And I thought of several cases where, derived words have different accent patterns depending on the accent patterns of the stem. But they are different from all the cases you gave in the sense that the derived words do not preserve the accent or stress of the stem. I give you one example. We have the suffix jin, which means a person or people. So that's a very productive suffix. You can make American people by adding jin after America jin, or France jin, or Romania jin, but there are exceptions, exceptional pattern in the output. There are three: Japanese people, Korean people, Taiwanese people. They are the derived words, Taiwan jin, Chosen jin, Nihon jin. They are accented on the stem. Oh, sorry, on the suffix.
On the suffix, right? And
the traditional analysis is that they are exceptions because the stems are accented on the final syllable. That's an irregular stress accent pattern in the language. So because the stems are irregularly accented on the final syllable, the derived words are accented on the suffix. That's the traditional analysis. And I was wondering if your analysis can, account for those irregular patterns.
No, but is this a case in which you are required to differentiate? So is it the case that jin derivatives have to have a stress that differs from the stress of the base? So is this a paradigm distinctness effect?
Yeah, that's the case, yeah.
I see. So then does that then mean that America is one of the unaccented words, right? So America jin, that's okay.
America jin.
I see.
Yeah, that's a regular pattern.
I see. So then this is then a case of paradigm distinctness, but I don't know why we should have paradigm distinctness in the case of jin.
I see. Okay. And if time permits, I have another general question that relates to what Shigeto said in his introduction to you. He said that you no longer want the syllable in phonological analysis. That worried me a little bit because, Shigeto and I have been talking about the relevance of the syllable in Japanese, which has been labeled as moral language.
Right.
But can you give us one or two references, if you have any, to...
So there is a very large project that I stopped working on because I've been doing this cycle business. But there is a paper on my website. It's a very short paper that went into the memorial shrift for the late Ross Shu. He was a UCLA professor of linguistics and my friend and colleague at UCLA. And so I wrote a paper talking about a phenomenon of English. This is managerial lengthening, as in Canada Canadian. And I try to show that there are certain, so it's not just that I think syllables should not exist. I don't think that that syllables are doing as much for us as we initially thought, but I actually think that there is a unit that has actually been quite popular with Japanese phoneticians, among others, and that is the vowel-to-vowel interval that does somewhat better in many respects. The best that the vowel-to-vowel interval does in phonology, so leaving aside the phonetic data that appears to show that the vowel-to-vowel interval gives you a better way to model durational invariance effect. So the durational invariance at the level of the segment, if you view the segment in the context of the vowel-to-vowel interval, then if you view it in the context of the syllable. So there are references beginning from the late 80s, there are references on that, and then there is more recent work by done in Japan. But I think that from my point of view as a phonologist, the most important thing that the vowel-to-vowel interval does is it explains something that is striking about, as a universal, as far as I know, this is a universal of rhyming systems.
Mm-hmm.
And that is that rhyming domains, the domain of required identity in rhyming verse. And I know that Japanese doesn't, Japanese has something else, has assonance, but genuine rhyming, where you can tell where the beginning of the domain, what is the beginning of the domain of identity and what is the end of the domain of identity. Genuine rhyming refers to domains that are identical to either single vowel-to-vowel intervals or sequences of contiguous sequences of vowel-to-vowel intervals, including in cases in which the last interval is not the last interval of the word. So these are the interesting cases.
Mm-hmm. I see.
So, there is something very striking about this that to me suggests that there is, in addition to that, there are various little detailed effects in the stress pattern of many languages, including the stress and length patterns of English that are involved in the Canada-Canadian phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
So that one is on my website, but I'm happy to send you the paper. And yes, there is a ton of other stuff on, I'm not opposed to syllables. I think they don't do anything for you. I think that what's good about syllables is done by other things.
Okay.
Can I feel a little responsible, so can I follow up a little bit?
Yes, please.
But this V2V interval notion does distinguish light syllables and heavy syllables in Japanese. So in that sense, we are not replacing that distinction.
That's correct.
So V2V interval can capture that difference between light and heavy syllables that we discussed with. So no.
Right. So I think Haru, what you meant is that if you talk about the nucleus of the syllable, mm-hmm. right? The nucleus of the syllable that can contain one mora or two moras, mm-hmm. right? Or if you have a syllable containing a vowel and a nasal mora, mm-hmm. well, then the vowel-to-vowel interval will contain both a vowel and a mora, and possibly the following onset.
Okay.
And so calculating weight differences is exactly as Shigeto says, will not become impossible all of a sudden when you go from a syllable model to a vowel-to-vowel interval model. There will be translations between the two.
Mm-hmm. When you said vowel-to-vowel, you mean from the onset of the vowel to the onset of the next vowel or to the
end of the domain.
Okay.
That's correct.
Okay.
That is
Understand.
correct. Yeah. So in many cases there will be equivalent distinctions that can be drawn. In some cases, the vowel-to-vowel interval gives you more finer grained distinctions, which appear to be necessary.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And one of them is this distinction between intervals consisting of just a bare vowel versus intervals consisting of a vowel followed by a single consonant. So both of them, in syllabic terms, those are both light syllables, but actually there is a difference in weight between them. And the Canada-Canadian phenomenon displays that difference.
Mm-hmm. And the paper is on your website.
The paper is on my website, but if I will send it to you, and then or whoever wants to have that paper, if you my email address is on this handout, you can write to me and I will send it to you. But it's on my website.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
You're most
Yeah,
welcome.
and actually, Kato Sensei at NICT has a really nice paper about how that affects the perception of speech rate.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah,
That is correct. Yes, that's correct. Yes, so it's Kato et al. I was blocked on the name of the linguist I had in mind, and in fact, you mentioned him to me a while ago. Yes.
We have time for one short question. Kanan wanted to ask a question, so do you please go ahead?
Thanks. I just wanted to follow up on something that you said when you were discussing Shigeto's previous question about kind of potential words versus actual words. It strikes me that we like there are two things at work here, at least to my understanding. So there's the kind of the potentiation factor, such that id, idical, id, idgy, id, idify. Like that's I share your judgment on that. But even cases where there is not that same potentiation, like IDI or other stuff, where other cases that are more kind of isolated or idiosyncratic, they still show lexical conservatism. Like they still show the effect of the helpful remote base only if the remote base exists, right? So isn't it, I mean, it seems like we have to kind of tease apart two different things, right? Is that a clear comment or question, or am I not being clear?
No, so can you say once, just repeat the two things that have to be distinguished?
So it seems like you were talking about people can invoke remote bases that they haven't even heard. And so that seems to support the observations with id, idity, that kind of thing. But we would then expect for any affix,
yes,
like kind of lexical conservatism effects, even in the absence of those remote bases, right? Because they could just, hypothesize some ones they haven't heard before and take advantage of that pattern. But it looks like that's not always the case, at least from my findings and from some of your findings, that like there are cases where people don't do this, which are precisely the cases where they don't know the remote base. But I mean, those are accepted from, those are not looking at these id type cases where the potentiation is very strong. Does that make sense?
Okay, so yes, indeed. So unfortunately, I did some thinking about this, which did not result even in my taking a note on this, but the thinking was precisely thinking about what we might know to be able to predict that, let's say, choral does not have chorality as a derivative. And my sense was, these were back of an envelope calculations or thoughts, that it is possible to come up with considerations that will allow you to predict that chorality is not possible, whereas choralhood is, right? I haven't gone anywhere with that, but you're absolutely right to call me out on this point, because you're right. Unless we are able to predict which conceivable derivatives that could function as remote bases do not exist, unless we can predict that, then of course we have to say that unattested words are impossible words, rather than take the somewhat different line that I was presenting a second ago. And I I mean, I think we haven't tried hard enough. Let's put it that way.
That's fair. That's right. That's a good point.
Okay, that's
Thank you.
and I had more thoughts than that, but right now I blanked out on them. So it's kind of late in Boston. So I'm not sure I can say much more than that. But
no worries.
Everything you said is right. Everything.
No worries. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Let me wrap up the event, and after that, we will. Anybody who wants to say hello to Donca can remain after the official end of the event, and she might be able to say hello, and you can show your face at that time. I'd like to thank the System Ligiwa, who arranged and organized, who was behind the organization of today's meeting, and also today's plenary talk by Professor Donca Steriade was supported by the Institute of Cultural and Linguistic Studies at Keio University and the Phonetic Society of Japan, as well as the Linguistic Lab at International Christian University. Let me make some announcement for two upcoming talk series. The first one will be on November 7th, 1 week from now, from 5 p.m. Shin Ishihara from Lund University and Cedric Badin from University of Lille will give talks about prosody. One on Japanese, the other one on Shingajija, spoken in the Comoro Islands. And the third part of the Keio ICU Linguistic Colloquium Season 2 will be held 2 weeks from now, roughly 2 weeks from now. It's on a Friday, November 13th, and Karthik Derivational from Michigan State University and Samuel Tilson from Cornell University will share their research. November 7th event on Saturday next week will start at 5 p.m. November 13th event on Friday will begin at 10 a.m. Japan Standard Time. Thank you all who participated in today's colloquium, and we hope to see you in our next talks. The recording will now be stopped.